I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Larry Hancock, well-known UAP researcher, author, and board member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. Larry brings his formal training in history and cultural anthropology to his research and writing on Cold War history and national security topics. A graduate of the University of New Mexico, he earned his BA with honors, majoring in history, cultural anthropology, and education. Following service in the U.S. Air Force, his career in computer communications and technology marketing allowed him the opportunity to become involved in and consult on strategic analysis and planning studies. Larry is the author of 7 books on topics in national defense and UFO history and joins us today to discuss the UFO news saga as it continues. So Larry, welcome back. So last time we were talking about the UAP pattern recognition study. This is something you guys are working on for the SCU, but we have had so much movement in this UFO story. And from what I understand, you've completed that paper. Now you're working on a UAP intention study. One paper's been published, another's in peer review, and 2 more are in progress. Can you tell me about those?
Sure. Basically, this is a historical study. It's not contemporary. We're dealing with the period of 1945 through 1975, primarily because we can get solid documented data there from Blue Book, from Air Force investigations, Army, FBI. So it's an historical study. So we have indeed published a 64-page study, pattern analysis, basically, of UAP activity through that time period in the military space, focused especially on the atomic warfare complex. And that's published. It's been out for about 3 months now. It's available on the SCU website. And the data is also available on the Harvard server. So that's done. We have that was a pattern study. Basically, do you see anything anomalous in the patterns of activity? Follow that up with an indication study, which basically says, does that seem to mean anything? What does it indicate? If there are patterns, what would it indicate? And what we do in that is standard practice, set out a series of different scenarios, look at the patterns, the activities, and rate the scenarios from least likely to most likely. That paper is in peer review. Hopefully it should be out within a couple of months. We did, however, take some of the results from that paper, and you might find it interesting. We have published a paper on the SCU review that basically is a methodology for the study of intentions in UAP activities. And it uses what we've done in that pattern study and indication study and says, all right, here's a protocol, a process to objectively study this in different venues. I mean, we picked one particular venue. You could pick your own. So that is in print now and contains some of our preliminary conclusions for what was happening in the military space. We have decided to extend that. We've got the database. It's a big database. We put a lot of work into it to look at what was happening in the civilian space at the same time. Civilian space, civilian sphere of activity, if you would. And we're currently engaged in a pattern analysis of that, which is very interesting because, first of all, you say, are there any particular patterns in civilian activity? Does it change over time? Daylight versus nighttime? What's being seen where over time? But then we will compare it to the military space and say, is there something different that was going on in the civilian sphere versus the military sphere? So that pattern, we'll actually in the process of starting charting those patterns now. It took a lot more work, honestly, than we had thought to reconcile all the data and go back through it and look at the activities. So that's in process now, and we'll follow that up by an indication study as well. So it's a long process. It will be years by the time it's finished. When we're done with all 4, we'll step back and say, all right, what if we were the intelligence community, what would you do then? You would write an estimate of the situation. which we will do if we all live that long.
Ah, well, there you go. So again, this is coming out through the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. I want to put in a plug for this. Actually, I joined, it's free to join, and I will put links in. I love the work that the SCU is doing. I mean, it is top tier, scientific, credible. It doesn't make a lot of assumptions, and it uses the best, most rigorous data and methods possible. And so, for anybody out there who's interested in the UAP topic, I definitely want to point them towards the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. It is just, again, it's blown pretty much everybody away in terms of the quality of work that your team has been doing. Now, in terms of writing these papers, one of the challenges is having good information to work from, right? And in terms of, UAP, UFO topics, it's always been kind of a challenge, right? Because so much of the data is anecdotal. Much of the time it's someone reported that they saw this, and then you get into these issues of, how credible is this person, or were they just mistaken? I mean, there could be 100 different things. And then more recently, we have had so much movement in the narrative, right? That one of my worries is that it's really clouding the clear scientific analysis of this. And that would be something that probably your team might be struggling with a bit, as well as Arrow and the government, right? I mean, everybody's trying to work with the best data and make the best decisions possible to understand what's going on, and at the same time, it's almost like the sand is shifting under your feet. Is that been a challenge at all?
It's a challenge from two directions. For us, honestly, I would say it's not a diversion, but it's a matter of focus and attention. You know, the work that we're doing involves a lot of slogging. I can't tell you how many Sundays, weekends that we've been on Zoom calls, reconciling reports, and you'd like to give that up and go look at the headlines, right? I mean, who does not want to look at crashes and recoveries? You gotta. So it's a bit of a diversion just for ourselves emotionally. The interesting thing, though, is AARO and NASA, the work they're doing at the moment appears to have determined that they're totally disregarding the historical context, which of course is what we're dealing with. So since they've decided only to look at contemporary events and not look at what we're dealing with, you know, it's it's not a problem for them because they're not distracted by our data and don't appear really to be that interested in the historical elements. So yeah, it is difficult for different reasons, I think, dealing with the contemporary surge in media coverage.
Yeah. Well, let me get into that a little bit, and I'm kind of going to go off my questions list a little bit, but I guess the way that I would describe what I've seen is UFOs came back into the popular consciousness. They never really left, but they came back into the headlines through the Nimitz sightings, right? And so you had the Tic Tac, you had the Nimitz carrier group, you actually had a bunch of military encounters that happened around that time as well. And it was captured, on video. It was captured on FLIR. There was pretty hard data. You had pilot reports from credible witnesses, so the quality of information was much higher than before. And what seems to have changed, and what definitely, I guess, the monkey wrench in all of this was when David Grusch came out last month as a whistleblower. Now, he is highly credible, and everything that I've heard, it says that he has an impeccable reputation, credentials. Everyone that I've met says this guy is the real deal. But one of the things that he has done is he's connected this modern narrative, which is very much data-based, back to this 70 to 80-year history, right? And there's a lot of anecdotes and lore and mythology, and who knows what's right and what's mistaken there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is very interesting because he's connected it to a lot of history. but in what I would think of as a fragmented manner, because we don't have any. He has offered up lots of commentary, lots of statements from individuals, lots of reports, but quite frankly, those sorts of things have been going on for decades. Uh, they started, especially in contemporary times, with the Disclosure Project in the 90s. But this is largely about crashes, recoveries, aliens, reverse engineering technology, you know, different streams of information, quite frankly, that would have been held by different people. And we don't have any breakdown. We don't have it. We don't know whether or not he's simply repeating things that he's heard, which is fine. Anecdotal is anecdotal, but we don't know what it was from whom. If we had some kind of something sketched out from him that says, okay, here's what I've heard about crashes from these three people or these 10 incidents, then we could evaluate it. If the same thing goes for recoveries, it's very hard to evaluate at this point in time. I think, if you don't know the sources and you don't know the story, we just have a very broad story, kind of like the intelligence community and the government has known about this forever, and they've been withholding it. That's too broad to wrestle with. I mean, we've been wrestling with it. I will give an example, Tim. In my book, Unidentified, I actually have a chapter devoted to foreign resources. And starting back in 1947, it explores incidents of recovered materials, which were evaluated in chemical laboratories, which spectroscopic analysis. They went to government departments. In one incident, something from 1952, purportedly from an object that was actually shot, maybe not shot down, recovered outside of Washington, D.C., was handed through several different levels. Started with the Navy. It went to the Air Force. Ruppelt writes about it in his Blue book, and finally went to Battelle as far as an Air Force investigation, and may very well have been the material, part of it at least, that went to the Canadian researcher who now the Canadian. It's like that's old. That goes back a long ways in terms of materials being recovered and analyzed, and the government knowing about it. Of course, the government knowing about it doesn't mean that the government did anything with it effectively. One of the questions that pops up is, well, if Blue Book has this and Blue Book gave it to Battelle, where's the analysis? Did they not do it? Oh, well, it just so happens Battelle was doing statistical studies, not physical studies. So maybe they just put it on a shelf and said, oh, thanks, great, we'll send it back when we're done. I'm not trying to parse that, but this story has been going along for so many decades that unless we can unravel the threads, it's just one more round of, I hate to call it sensation, but we've had those headlines before. We've had press conferences in Washington, D.C. And none of that, as you point out, none of that is specifically associated with what the Nimitz sighting, AARO, it's operating under that umbrella. But for example, AARO's charter, kind of looked at it again before we talked, has to do with threats. It's a Department of Defense study, essentially. Okay, threats, national security threats, aviation safety threats. I'm not sure that this crash materials. Okay, maybe a crash recovered object would count, but I'm not sure where that falls under their charter. To be frank, we know what I just said about their charter, what their focus is supposed to be, but we have yet to see anything about their collections protocols. They've given us a number of how many incidents they're looking at. But where'd you get them? Did you get them just from the Navy? Did you get them from the Air Force? The Air Force has said nothing. What'd you get from Homeland? What'd you get from FAA? We don't know. So our view into this, our view into it, quite frankly, is through the headlines and stories that the whistleblower incident is bringing up. It's, it's very divergent. I wish we had a better view, but it's hard to tell what's going on. It's also hard to tell how much of this is repetition. For example, we know that supposedly a decade or more ago, Bigelow Labs purportedly had recovered pieces of material from UAPs and were examining them. As information has emerged, it turns out that those were, as far as we can tell, pieces that have been collected from the UFO community, not pieces that have been collected from the national security community. So they've got a piece of material from Ubatuba, Brazil. Okay, fine. We have a piece of material from Ubatuba, Brazil. And if you want to see a detailed spectrometer and chemical analysis, there's actually an SCU paper on that was published last year. I don't know that many people have looked at it, quite frankly. But without rambling, let's just say this is a very long story, and how it ties together with what's in the headlines right now, befuddles me.
I think it's befuddling everyone. Again, when I started covering this, when I started following this story, it started with the Timmets, the Nimitz, and the Tic Tacs, right? And I'm familiar with all of the UFO history. How could you not be? As an American, how could you not be? It has filled our radio and television and media, comic books, you name it. Right? It's on the silver screen, and it has been for 70 years. So I think that we all know the backstory, right? Anybody who's watched the History Channel in the last 20 years or Discovery Channel, and we've all, I believe, for the most part, thought, well, there's a lot of myth and legend here. Maybe something is going on, but certainly what's on TV is not real, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be on national TV. That's been my thought. But so on June 5th, David Grusch came forward with the Leslie Kean article, right? And that was that for me, that was the head turner. It was, okay, we have crashed UFOs in our inventory. And again, that's a sea change compared to what came before that. Then he did the interview with Ross Coulthart. And in that interview, he'd said, well, when you have crashed vehicles, you have bodies that go with them, right? So all of this is secondhand information. And my thought then was, well, who knows? Maybe somebody's pulling his leg. Maybe he's being used or manipulated. It's difficult to tell. So last week, Senator Marco Rubio told News Nation that he's heard several firsthand accounts from individuals in quote unquote high positions in our government that support Grusch's controversial allegations. So what are your thoughts on this? I mean, can we view this as a success for the 2023 whistleblower provisions? And with Grusch and his impeccable credentials, and now Senator Marco Rubio, I mean, even though this is secondhand information, does the credibility factor add a depth of reality to this?
Well, I think a couple of things leap out. First of all, you have to take away the whistleblower aspect from the UAP data aspect, because the whistleblower thing essentially was a legal complaint to the IG about him trying to surface information that he'd heard. I don't know of any that he's actually said he saw firsthand. But what we know, because he was in a credible position related to this subject, that he had to have heard things. I mean, you couldn't have been in the job that he was in and not have heard things. So okay, that's fine. And then now he's complaining that people were stopping him from taking that information forward. Okay, that's the whistleblower complaint. And he got a very prestigious Washington, D.C. law firm to file the whistleblower complaint. Very whistleblower complaint. But that whistleblower complaint is about his information being blocked, stymied,
Yeah.
whatever. And the law firm actually, once it had filed the complaint, withdrew, saying our work is done. We were only here to deal with the legal issues of whistleblower complaint, the IG. They're out of it. So how that gets processed and how it gets processed inside the government is one thing by itself. The data that he's talking about is another. The data that he's taken to Rubio, the data that he's taken to, to House members, we really don't know if it's the same data that we've heard forever. If it is, it simply could indicate that he was talking with people. I mean, since the disclosure project started in the early 90s, we've had literally dozens of Air Force officers, pilots, IBM missile staff talk about encounters with, observations with UAPs. Not so many talking about actual recoveries, and certainly not so many talking about reverse engineering. That comes out of a much more limited sector. But in his position, quite frankly, I have to say, if I was advocating any of those things, I've been trying to tell that story for a long time. Would he have heard those stories? Most likely. I think I've seen it discussed that he did visit the Skinwalker Ranch, that he has talked to people that were involved in the Bigelow investigation. We know those people, including scientists. So I guess that's, again, where I'm kind of stymied. It's what stories is Rubio hearing? Are they new stories? Are they new stories from new people? Or are they just old stories that are new to Rubio, which are very sensational and very compelling? And I will have to tell you, my bookcase is full of them and has been from Lynn Stringfield's 12-year publishing history of 7 volumes on crashes and recoveries, and I loved it all. I don't, as you say, anybody who's been following this, anytime one of those came up, it's great. I love it. And if you hear it for the very first time, without hearing if it's been researched or deconstructed, you hear it for the very first time, it can be extremely persuasive, which could be true for Grusch, could be true for Rubio. We simply don't know. And that doesn't mean they're not sincere. We just don't know what they heard, when it came from, where it came from, and how long. Now, if it involves, I'll give a disclaimer, if it involves somebody who was running a government lab who said, yeah, we've got stuff that I've got this craft here that we've been reverse engineering, Senator. Okay, that's another story entirely. If it's somebody who supposedly was at Area 51 and discovered a new element and says, Senator, yeah, this is new. That's another story entirely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Said element has not emerged for a long time. But would Rubio know that? Maybe, probably not. So it's just, I'm not sure how well equipped they are to. I guess what would have made me more comfortable if they had approached the subject in a scientific manner and said, okay, whistleblower, bring all this stuff here, we're going to peer review it. We'll bring in people familiar with the subject. We'll do a pro and con, and we'll really assess it. Don't just talk to us. We need to be in a position to assess it. Maybe that's occurring now. I hope it is, but that doesn't sound like what they're saying to the press. What it sounds like is people are coming to them with stories that are really getting their attention. They're taking them seriously, but that's all I know. I don't see a check and balance.
Now, do you think that part of the confusion here is, and I could be mistaken, I don't know much about this, but crash recovery seems like it would be part of any kind of aircraft crash, right? So, test flights, I mean, new technologies, all sorts of very conventional Air Force stuff. And that happens all the time, right? They're always trying to beef up our military defenses. They're always testing new technologies. Crashes do happen. So do you think part of the issue could be that, when people talk about crash recovery, we just inherently assume it's a UFO, but maybe someone got confused along the way. Maybe it was a drone. Maybe it was something that folks just didn't understand that was very conventional. Just, it's dark, it's late, it's new technology, everybody's hush hush. People assume UFO. Maybe it's something much more mundane.
Well, even if I think it's probably even more complex than that. I write about that a bit in the book, but Kevin Randall wrote a book called Project Moondust. Okay, very good book. Basically traces the evolution of Air Force crash and recovery teams from the Korean War through the next several decades, actually, because yeah, we worry about recovering our own crashed aircraft, especially if they're experimental or developmental. Uh, there's an example of that being done in California with an F-117. They came up with a great cover story to, completely cloud what it was that's crashed, which is standard procedure. But when you're talking about foreign technology, and this is the interesting part, I could find a document that said foreign technology and kind of assume it was UAP. But that doesn't mean, it simply means it is foreign technology. Is it a recovered satellite? You bet. Does the CIA have memos on crash and recoveries? Yeah, but they are related to the crashes of foreign satellites and what they had to do covertly to negotiate with foreign governments to get the pieces for analysis, or covertly collect them. Even it can apply to aircraft, foreign aircraft, adversarial aircraft. So crashes and recoveries by nature in this realm is a security issue, because if it was not, the FAA would be handling it and you'd know all about it. So that's Project Moondust was a series of these teams that were formed first overseas during the Korean War, well, actually even during World War II, to recover enemy aircraft that was crashed so we could take a look at them. And then they brought it back to the US, and they were certainly operating during the Cold War. They were, and when you got a report of a downed object that was serious, they would try to collect it if there was something visible there. The Kecksburg is an example of that for people that are into this, where there appears to have been a crash and recovery, and you can argue all day long whether it was a satellite or a UAP, but somebody pulled a trailer in and put something on it and took it away. That much is established fact. So, yeah, I think what concerns me is even when you're reading the documents, you can't. If you were looking for UAPs, you would probably find UAPs, just because the documents themselves are pretty generalized. They're not getting specific. They're just telling you, it was a mission report, or we had a report of this and this team is investigating it. So I think that does cloud the issue, and for everybody. But that's been going on for a long time, and associated with it, of course, we know if a crash or recovery involved our technology or something new that was being developed, whether it's an aircraft, for that matter, let's say a lifting body. If anybody's ever seen the White Sands crash, it was a lifting body, folks. It was not a UAP, and yes, they blew it up by the range officer. It's easy to be fooled by that stuff, and people started lifting bits and pieces, putting it on the History Channel, putting it on the Discovery Channel, whatever. So I don't fault anybody in government right now that could be totally, being brought a host of stuff that looks very spectacular and, being confused by it all.
Yeah. Well, and it is very interesting though that, for anyone out there who's thinking, well, crash recovery, I've never heard anything about this. You mentioned the F-117. I think Nick Cook had written about that. And I'd completely forgotten about that, but that's an excellent example. So yeah, the crash happened. There was a cover story. They recovered the pieces. As I recall, there were also threats and intimidation, right, of witnesses. And so
Yeah, well, they're standard type security. And again, parsing out, is it a threat if I tell someone this is a national security matter and they're not supposed to talk to anybody under penalty of law? That's certainly intimidation, and it's intended to be intimidating, and it is a legal threat. So yeah, that occurs. That occurs all the time. And if it comes from somebody in a, well, I won't say a, black suit and coat, but if it comes somebody in plain clothes, legally under the law, that's perfectly procedurally correct. They're entitled to do that, and it is intimidating. And I'd probably take it as a threat too. And it gets worse than that. I mean, counterintelligence has come into play against people that wanted to see things that were national security issues. You know, people have been hoaxed, people have been fed false information. That's part of the game, unfortunately, which further clouds matters. But we have to accept it, and we have to deal with. That's one of the things that we've kind of become trapped in, especially with AARO, looking at it from a military perspective, because everything you're dealing with is under classification if it's serious. If you just set up a group to study UAPs within the military security community, do you really expect to hear anything back? No, I'm asking, where is the equivalent group in the scientific community with the authority and resources to say, okay, AARO, you decided it wasn't a security issue. Would you give us the stuff so we can take a look at it? Uh, you know,
yeah. Well, let me get briefly into the latest regulatory revisions to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. And this may add to the confusion. It may shed light on the subject. It will require the military and the government contractors to notify Aero of any crashed UFO material or reverse engineering projects within 60 days of the bill passing. And I believe there are further stipulations as well that come something like 180 days after that. So, do you think that this will, I mean, the Whistleblower Act itself seems to be producing results. Do you think that this aspect of it will produce anything?
well, I'll give you a cynical take because of those other books I did write on national security. And it gets into Title 10 versus Title 50 and actually U.S. legal codes. And the point is that national security agencies are authorized to lie, even to Congress. If it comes under certain levels of classification, compartmentalization, I mean, I've actually written about evidence where CI officers went onto the stand and lied in front of a judge and were convicted of perjury, but that was part of their job. That that is part of their job, and they understand that's part of their job. Um, and it was viewed as a, okay, you're a good guy. You knew what to think. You took the bullet. So if there really were the kind of crash reverse engineering, we've been working on this technology for 40 years. It would almost be like the movie. Yeah, we've been doing it. We didn't tell the president. He's not, doesn't have the need to know for this. He's not on the compartmentalized access list. And would they come forward regardless of Congress's law? I honestly doubt it. Uh, I, you know, if they had been a commercial firm, kind of like in the Corso model, who had been slipped a piece of technology that they didn't understand that they'd been working with, sure. Let's say it's a material science firm that they've been given something. It's like, this is great stuff. Can you reverse engineer it and build me something out of it that will stand up to Mach 80? You know, they, that there's two different things there. Again, it's pieces versus whole operational craft. I don't think if they have if the security system is kept craft like we saw in the movie uh, for 50 years, then no, it's not going to break now because the House Congress passed a law. Otherwise, yeah, it might flush out some things. It might flush out somebody that said, 20 years ago, I worked on an engineering project, which that could be investigated. I find that much more likely and more, if that guy comes forward, and if one of those people has come forward to Rubio or with a whistleblower, you can assign the FBI to that, and you can you can seriously investigate that sort of thing, and you might break something. So it's not that I'm totally discouraged. It's you know I do think I've looked at multiple congressional investigations over the years of different crimes, of different government covert actions, and it's almost impossible for the government to investigate itself unless
Yeah.
there is a true delimited crime that you can tie it to. That's why most most of the people in the mob and in organized crime get caught and prosecuted for cooking their books, and they for financial transactions, not for the actual crimes themselves. So I know that's off on a bit of a tangent, but I sometimes I think we're maybe not maybe a little naive about how the system actually works.
Yeah.
It's funny, we could believe it held it back all this time, and yet we would believe that they would give it to us now.
Well, I mean, ultimately, I guess the question underneath this is, do you think, regardless of their sources, I realize this is all secondhand information, but with Grusch and definitely with Marco Rubio, even though they're repeating information, do you think that's true? Do you think that the government has crashed UFOs? A lot of people have said that these have been moved into defense contractors and effectively sealed off. The government may not even know what anybody has where. But do you think that the underlying story is true?
I think the government has had materials, bits and pieces, and and things they did recover, and they're really not sure the source. I do not think the government holds fully operational alien craft that are working and have been and that have been reverse engineered to the extent that we've actually made something from them, not just studying them, but made something from them. I do not think the government has bodies. I just I both of those escape me. And and I cannot understand why, in the case of the reverse engineering actual craft, that we've seen that we would be holding all that and spending all the time, effort, and money on our own technology. It, I would tend to buy into Corso's story. If we had that, it would have been fed into the system, into the commercial system, so that somebody was making big money off of it. But we've seen nothing of those, you know, sensational, dramatic. Show me the show me the quantum driven drone, and I'll buy on that. Show me why we're doing a sixth generation interceptor that looks a lot like the third generation interceptor. It's just stealthier. Why would you be holding that forever, right? Unless and not deriving some value of it. So I guess I'm a pragmatist in that regard. No, I do think I think in many cases, and we talked about that earlier, they have had things in their hands that they didn't even do anything with, that they didn't know what to do with them. It was handed off to somebody. It's not my job. Why don't you look at it? I don't know what it is. It's amazing the lack of communication and coordination. all of those three incidents that I talked about earlier that dealt with actual recovered physical material that people at MIT analyzed and Dow Chemicals analyzed, and that ended up the people they took them to were the Bureau of Standards because they were anomalous. Which, you know, where are those Bureau of Standards files anyway? But I will say Joel Carpenter ought to get real credit for doing that kind of research. So, summary to your question, yes, bits and pieces, yes, evidence if it had been pursued, evidence that has been pursued to some extent, but that kind of sensational stuff, I'd love to see it. I'm as eager as you are, Tim. After what, since 1964, looking at this, it's about darn time it showed up.
Well,
I
on
could
that
clear
note,
off my bookshelf and go to something new.
Larry, let me thank you so much for your time today. And actually, I want to close by asking about the SCU conference that's coming up at the end of July. I was going to ask about that earlier, and I forgot. This is something that people can attend virtually, I think. I believe it's being conducted completely virtually this year. And again, I will put links into the SCU. I definitely want people to learn more about this. It's not going to cost them money. It's an open, I believe, nonprofit organization. Again, amazing work that yourself and a really a large team of people are doing. Can you tell me a little bit about the conference and why people
Sure.
should attend that?
The conference is virtual. And I think the other thing that really distinguishes the conference this year is two things. The scope of the presenters and speakers. It is an international conference. We have presenters from at least a dozen different countries. We're looking at this as a global phenomenon. Right now, if you read the news, you would think that it only happened in the United States. You know, it's like, okay, our view of it from a scientific standpoint is that it's global. And SCU is working directly with French groups that are investigating it, have been for decades, and other groups. But so the fact that you will have international speakers giving different views of their research and their approach to the research is something that you're really not going to see anywhere else. And you're certainly not going to see it in the media. Okay. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit more conservative, but it ranges from what people have done, what databases have been built, what studies are being done internationally, and what can be done in terms of collections. You know, one of the things that AARO is doing is simply taking collections from within their system. NASA, in the NASA team meeting, they talked about, well, we could prototype new sensor systems and designs and maybe collect some real-time information on UAPs, but we don't have a budget. So we can just give recommendations to AARO. And AARO will say, well, we don't have a budget. We've got, 4 people and we can barely handle the reports that are coming in. SCU is taking the approach that if we want to be serious about this, somebody has to prototype those devices. We have to field them, test them, and then pay for a network, to actually collect scientific data, because we're not going to get it other than doing it ourselves. So that's one thing I think that differentiates us. We're not, how can I say this? We're not feeding off the headlines. It's kind of like, it's our job, we're going to do it. University community can join to the extent that it can. Somebody's got to do it. Professionals have to do it. The other thing is that the studies themselves run the gamut. There will be some new case studies, some rather dramatic new case studies that are under review. There will be some papers that have been published by SCU members evaluating propulsion systems. So this is relatively hard science. It's hard history. So it's what I would say recommends the conference is kind of like A, the attitude of SCU, B, the international nature of the phenomena and our approach to it, and C, basically our charter that says, okay, people, if you want to see something done, you need to join us and help, because otherwise just keep reading the paper.
Well, Larry, that conference is coming up on July 29th and 30th. I had that written down in my notes. I will put a link in so that people can get more involved. I'm also going to put links in the show notes for all of the papers that you've written that are currently published out there, and you have more coming in the near future. Let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Oh, always enjoy being on Tim. It's a great discussion, makes me think.